Hi, I'm Lou Eisen, boxing writer, author, podcaster, historian, all-around schmuck, and I'm going to turn my phone off there. Today we have a special guest on Ring Talk. We have Arne K. Lang. I love Arne K. Lang. Anytime you speak to any boxer or any author in the world of boxing, and you're writing a book, they say the same thing. If you want to know how to write a book, read Arne Lang, because he knows how to write a book. People put out 1,200-page books, 800-page books. Arne puts out these magnificent books, and they're absolutely perfect. There's not a wasted comma or letter. He's the best boxing writer on the planet. My favorite book, until I got his new one, was the Nelson-Wolgast Fight in the San Francisco boxing scene. This book was magnificent. And so I had to research Arne, and Arne's a sociologist. He taught at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, University of Nebraska, and the Tuskegee University. He's also, they say, a leading authority. He's the leading authority on the history of boxing and American sports gambling. He's the leading authority on the planet. He lives and writes in Las Vegas. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Sweet Science online. If you haven't read that, you haven't read anything about boxing. And it mentions the other credits, which I just said. This is his fifth book, Clash of the Little Giants, the fight between Canada's George Dixon and Terry McGovern. And it's an incredible privilege and pleasure to have the wonderful and magnificent Mr. Arne K. Lang on. Arne, welcome.
You're being too generous, but thank you, Lou. I've never had an introduction quite like that, but I appreciate it.
Well, they should all be like that. I mean, I'm telling you, every author, I can name them all to you. If you want to know how to write about a boxing book, read Arne Lang. He knows what to do. There's no excess verbiage. He gets all the facts in. It's written entertainingly. You learn and you love. And, that you can't say anything better than that.
Well, of course, we both share an interest in boxing in the old days, in the early days of Queensbury boxing. My main interest when I write books is the era around that straddles the beginning of the 20th century. The early 1900s, late 1890s. It's a fascinating era. The sport was hadn't found its footing yet. There was a lot going on, and it was really a very interesting era. And the people that fought back then, I'm not sure how good they were in terms of could they beat Terence Crawford today? I rather suspect not, but these were tough, rugged guys and very, very interesting characters.
Yeah, it's great that you say that. I love that era too. And these guys, and you do this better than anyone on earth, they deserve to be remembered. So you put the flesh on the bones and you make them real people. And when I read this book, your most recent book, I just thought, after reading, I thought, it's criminal people don't know Terry McGovern. They don't know how great he was. Angelo Dundee, my mentor, was friends of Charlie Goldman, who trained him. And Charlie, as you know better than anyone, idolized Terry McGovern.
Yeah. Charlie was a small guy too. He was smaller than Terry McGovern. He fought in the lowest weight classes, but yeah, he was Marciano's trainer, and he could talk about Terry McGovern for hours.
He patterned his hair after Terry McGovern.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he said to Angelo, there never was a fighter like him. He said, you could only. He said, film can't do him justice. He said, not even Dempsey was like him. He called him, and I use this in my book, an elemental force of nature. He said, he came at you like he was shot out of a cannon.
Yeah, I'm actually less interested in Terry McGovern's style of fighting and so forth than I am the reaction of people to him. And in his heyday, it was a very brief heyday, but in his heyday, there was no athlete more admired in Brooklyn than Terry McGovern. The only one I can think of it maybe was Gil Hodges of the Dodgers when the Dodgers finally won the World Series. For a time there, Gil Hodges was sainted, and the Irish community of Brooklyn in Terry McGovern's day sainted him too.
And deservedly so. I mean, when you talk about, versus Bud Crawford, the more I read about John L. Sullivan, and Bert Sugar mentioned that, he said Sullivan wasn't a guy who stood there and a lot of fighters and looked, fainted and looked for shots. He said Sullivan was basically a barroom brawler. The guy just came in looking to take you out with one shot. So it's incredible that anyone would have thought he had a chance against a guy like Corbett. But McGovern had skills, right? McGovern knew what to do. He was taught well. And he had a brother that fought too, didn't he?
Yeah, he did have a brother who wasn't nearly as distinguished as he was. He actually had two brothers. I believe the other one also dabbled in boxing. And then the brother you're referencing was good enough to be a main event fighter, but he wasn't nearly in Terry McGovern's class.
Is it fair to say that fighters like McGovern, Arturo Gatti, they have exciting fighters, but short shelf lives?
Yes, obviously. Well, of course, we don't know if Gotti would have had dementia, but he certainly, had all the preconditions that we associate with dementia. Dementia is funny for some people. It strikes in late middle age, and for just about every boxer who fights a lot of rounds, it creeps up on them very late in life and gets commingled with other kinds of ailments and so forth. So we really can't attribute their demise to dementia, but it happens in so many cases. We know that punches to the head over a long period of time, almost inevitably means that someone's, just not going to die the way and with the kind of dignity we all hope to die with.
Right. Ferdy Pacheco wrote in his book how Ali would lay against the ropes, and he would say to Ali would say to him, "Well, I'm toughening up my brain," and he said, "Muhammad, you can't toughen your brain and your organs like your fingers when you're learning guitar."
Actually, Muhammad Ali, he was interviewed in two different issues of Playboy magazine, many years apart. And in the second interview, I don't know the exact year, but Ali would say the same thing. He would say, when I spar, I lean against the ropes and I let my opponent hit me in the head because I've got to toughen that muscle. But what? That's not a muscle.
No.
That's, and certainly, looking back, it was inevitable almost that Muhammad Ali, this great, great human being, was going to die in such dire circumstances.
Yes, and it's interesting to say that because I spoke to my neurologist and I asked him about Ali, and he said, "Well, I can't make a diagnosis in any fighter unless I examine them." But he said, "From the last time you mentioned it to me, I looked up some statistics. From when he won the title to when he first left in '67." He was getting hit maybe 20 times a fight in the head, if that. He said After that, he's getting hit 300 times a fight, maybe 120 times in the head, times 40 fights. He said the brain can't take that.
That's right. And it didn't.
No.
And
With McGovern, his descent from great fighter into dementia was a lot quicker. It was similar to Ad Wolgast.
Yes.
Similar style, but who you wonderfully described in the in your other book. It was similar to him, right? Whereas Dixon's was more played out or drawn out over a long period of time.
Yes. And in most cases, like I say, dementia or CTE or Parkinson's, whatever you want to call it, in most cases, for a boxer who's fought a lot of rounds, it happens later in life, and it sort of creeps up on him. And but in the case of Terry McGovern and Wolgast, it happened quite. It actually, you could see the symptoms of it while they were still fighting
in their 20s. Yeah, and I guess that has to be attributed to their style. for the ring?
That, yeah, and also obviously there's a genetic factor involved here. The strangest thing is many years ago, I did a radio show here in Las Vegas for quite a long time. And one time I had Archie Moore on. He actually came with George Foreman. Archie Moore, if you look at his record, he had over 200 fights. He answered the bell for an enormous number of rounds. When he was on my radio show, he was probably in his early 70s, and he was still sharp. He had good recall. He didn't slur. There was no indication of any cognitive disorder. And so obviously it's, some people are, kind of like people we've known in our generation who've smoked cigarettes well into their 80s with no discernible lung problems. Well, that happens, but of course it's in a very small minority.
That's right. When I had my heart attack, I asked my cardiologist. I said, I have a friend, and he's 6'2", 350 pounds. He smokes 6 cigars a day. And she said, when did his grandparents die? I said, they're still alive.
Yeah.
In the hundreds. She said, it's genetics. You don't have that on the side.
Yeah.
So, when you look at someone like George Chavallo, he's in a very bad shape now.
So I've heard.
But it didn't hit him till his 80s.
Yes.
Like
yes.
I knew him, but he doesn't know where he is or who he is. But
yes,
that didn't happen till he was 82, 81.
Yes.
And up until then, he was fine. But it's just, Angelo Dundee said no one gets out of the sport unscathed. And I guess, would you agree that Dixon had it, but because of his fighting style, it took longer to afflict him? Of course, the alcoholism didn't help either.
Yeah. Well, both George Dixon and Terry McGovern died in there. They were both 37 years old. And so their situations were atypical. But I think in the case of George Dixon, it was the accumulation of rounds more than anything else. And also the fact that being a black fighter in that era, he was exploited like all black fighters. And so when he could no longer make a living with his fists, he had nothing to fall back on financially to smooth his transition into, his golden years.
That's, and partly Tom O'Rourke, who slapped him around at times and treated him like
yes.
a coach. And same with Al Herford and Joe Gans. I mean, they could blackball you, and there's nothing you could do about it.
Yes. Al Herford, Al Herford was a Baltimore man, and Gans pretty much Joe Gans' manager for his entire career. They did have a period of separation, but Al Herford came back to Joe Gans toward the end of Gans' career. But from what I've read about Al Herford, he was just not a good person. He was
dirtbag. I mean,
he was that good. Yeah, there's no other way to put it.
I mean,
he had other, among other things, he was the head of the bookmakers that operated at the racetrack there in Baltimore, and so he would collect their, if they had what they called a pitch, if they were allowed to come on the racetrack and take bets, they had to pay off Al Herford, because he was the gatekeeper, so to speak. And then, I'm sure he exploited those people or took advantage of them, just as he did the boxers who fought at this club.
Yeah, Dixon said he never once got what he was promised in a contract from Al Herford, and there's nothing he could do about it.
Yeah, and of course, Al Herford's not here to defend himself, but I'm sure that's true.
I know one of the chapters of my book, I have the Gans McGovern fight, which you know very well. You know better than anyone. And, where Gans took a dive. And what I've read was that Herford said, Frank Earn won't fight you again for the lightweight title unless he thinks he can beat you. And I mean, that doesn't make sense because he still had to wait 2 or 3 years to get him again, even though he deliberately took a dive, and nothing happened to McGovern. The only one who suffered was Gans.
Well, I'm not sure anything should have happened to McGovern. My opinion is a lot of fights in boxing history that are thought to have been fixed weren't. Maybe that's, I've lived too long in Las Vegas, but however, it's pretty hard to think that Gans McGovern was not a fake. And the fault was Gans and his manager, Al Herford. The fight was in 1910. You could fight only 6 rounds back then in Illinois, and the fight was in Chicago. But despite the small number of rounds, it was a big, big event. It was really a real mega fight. And it got the whole fight fans all over the country talking. And Gans' performance was so limp that A, either he was drugged, or B, he did what he was supposed to do, which was lose intentionally. And it often has been said that fighters as good as Gans, who are really smooth and clever and shifty and so forth, that those people don't know how to take a dive well, if you follow
He's not an actor.
Yeah, it's when they don't fight full bore, it's just obvious for some reason. When you're that good, you just to revert to someone fighting under wraps or whatever is just not easy to do.
No, and that was common with him. One of the few times they say Ray Arcel got angry is they said, we heard that Benny Leonard and Jack Johnson and Gans and Dixon and McGovern had a lot of fixed fights. And Arcel said, not in the way you believe it. He said, it's not that their fights were fixed, it's that people were so afraid of them that unless they promised not to kill them immediately, they wouldn't get in the ring with them.
Yeah. And that was especially true of black fighters back in that era, who were told, don't take this guy out quick because the paying customers will be disappointed. Please let this fight go rounds before you start fighting full bore.
Yeah, let him bloody your nose a bit or your lip and make it look like he has a chance. I mean, the story of Dixon where someone said to him, you never fight on the ropes and you always fight in ring center, and he pulled his pant leg up, and it might have even been in your book, and he had gashes in his leg because people from his opponent's trainers and fans of his opponent would hit him in the leg with implements.
I found a newspaper reference from Dixon's manager, Tom O'Rourke, which indicated that often when Dixon fought, ringsiders would hit him in the ankles, reach through the ropes and hit him. But yet I'm very skeptical of that. I'm really very, very skeptical. We, in a private conversation, we talked about Nat Fleischer's 5-part series on the black athlete, going back, by the way, to the bare knuckle days in England and bringing it all the way forward to to Joe Louis. Mm-hmm. And there's so much in there in those books that I consider just lore, not facts, but lore. They make for good stories. Nat Fleischer understood that for these books to make any money, they had to appeal to young readers who would otherwise turn to adventure novels. And he put a lot of fiction into his books. And even though Tom O'Rourke once said that Dixon got whacked in the lower extremities as he was fighting when he got on the ropes in certain locales, I still take that with a grain of salt. I just have trouble believing that.
Yeah, I would be afraid to approach any fighter, and I think that fear would go back to even then. You'd have to be incredibly stupid to go out and do something like that to a professional fighter.
Yeah, I just have trouble believing it. Okay,
So, I've never seen. I was going to say you have in the Nelson-Wolgast book. You have, and Lennox Lewis, when I showed this to him, was blown away. You have the single greatest boxing photograph I've ever seen in my entire life, including the alley standing over Liston. You have the photograph of the three of them, of Dixon, Walcott, Barbados Joe, and Joe Gans sitting. I'll show this on camera.
Yeah.
And that to me is the most remarkable piece of not just sports history, but American and world history. That is incredible. And I wanted to say, I'm not sure, I wanted to ask you, the man in between Dixon and Walcott with the white hat, because you have it unknown, it looks a bit like George Byers, but I'm not sure if that is.
Could be.
But that's a remarkable photo.
Yeah, Dixon came out of Eastern Canada, Prince Edward Island, Halifax, Nova Scotia, and so forth. As did George Byers. As did a lot of
Langford,
black fighters who found their way to Boston around the turn of the century.
George Godfrey, Sam Langford.
It was quite a colony, and most of those, not all certainly, but a good number of those outstanding and long forgotten black boxers actually were born in Nova Scotia, or Prince Edward Island, one of the eastern provinces of Canada.
Yeah, Byers and Godfrey were first cousins. And when I've tried to pitch this as a documentary and to Canadian Post Office for a stamp, I always tell them the black population in PEI today is infinitesimal. But in the 1880s, it was half of infinitesimal. And to produce two outstanding world-class fighters in such a small area is just unheard of.
Yeah, and of course they had to go to the United States to hone their skills, and almost invariably that meant Boston back then.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing I get asked all the time, why did Arturo Gotti go to New Jersey? Why did Art Hafey go to San Diego? Why? Because there's nothing up here. They don't have the world-class trainers, and they don't have world-class sparring. And George Chuvalo said to me, he said about himself, he'll be the Canadian heavyweight champion 50 years after he's dead. So he said, saying that you're the champion of Canada, he said, it's nice, but really it counts for nothing. So if you want to make it as a boxer or as a comedian like Jim Carrey or as a writer, you got to be in the States. That's just the way it is. And larger scale, more people.
Yeah.
But Dixon, when he came down, I mean, when he fought McGovern the first time, he was already on the downside of his career, wasn't he?
Yes. It's a lot of people think that Dixon actually, some people, in fact, there's a book about George Dixon, which actually ends when George Dixon goes to New Orleans and performs on that triple header down there, topped by John L. Sullivan, Corbett. They were, it was called a boxing carnival. It was a 3-night affair with title fights on each night, culminating with the big shebang, John L. Sullivan and Corbett. And some people actually think that was the peak, even though George Dixon didn't fight somebody who was going to give him much of a fight, a guy named Jack Skelly. Some people think that was the peak of Dixon's career, and then there was a slow descent after that. And of course, he didn't fight McGovern until sometime after that.
Why? I mean, Skelly was basically an amateur, but amateurs back then had more respect than professionals.
Yes. Well, back then there were a lot of amateurs who were. It was. I mean, the ranks of amateur boxers were very, very deep back circa 1900. There were many, many, many more amateur boxers than pros. And some of the best amateurs could hold their own with established professionals. They thought that of Jack Skelly. And Skelly probably could hold his own with a run-of-the-mill professional. He beat some pretty good pros. But against George Dixon, he was out of his league. George Dixon was just on a different level than his contemporaries in his weight class.
I know James J. Corbett, fought as an amateur and wouldn't turn professional until he was offered these great sums of money that he just couldn't turn down. So on the Carnival Champions, the first night was, I think, Dixon, right? And then
Actually, that was the middle fight, is my understanding.
so Joe
The first
McCullough,
fight was Jack McAuliffe,
Jack McAuliffe,
who is the lightweight champion.
Napoleon
And,
of the prize ring.
pardon me?
The Napoleon of the prize ring.
Yes, Jack McAuliffe, who retired undefeated. He was the first fight, and then the Dixon Skelly was the middle fight, and then of course the big one was Sullivan Corbett. They were 3 successive nights in New Orleans.
And McAuliffe also fought a Torontonian named Harry Gilmore, who gave him a good fight. Didn't win, but gave him a good fight.
Canadian, considered the lightweight champion of Canada, but maybe best known for the boxing club he operated in Chicago,
right,
which turned out a wealth of great fighters in the smaller weight classes around 1900, 1905, and so forth.
It's interesting when I read about his comments about Wolgast and Mexican Joe Rivers. And he said, I'm sorry that everyone feels this way, but I was ringside. I wasn't fourth row. I was ringside. And I didn't see Ad Wolgast land a punch that was foul. And of course, the other people said, well, then maybe you need glasses because, the punch was definitively foul. But then again, on the film of the fight, you can't tell from the angles filmed.
Yeah.
So Dixon fights McGovern, and McGovern at that point was still at the top level of his career.
Yes, Dixon was on the way up, and McGovern was on the way up. George Dixon was on the way down.
And
which is the nature of boxing, by the way.
Right. And Terry McGovern was an anomaly in that he wasn't racist like a lot of managers and fighters. He genuinely liked Joe Gans. He had black friends, Goldman, Jewish friends. I mean, he didn't discriminate against people. Right? Is that?
I don't know. I go to gyms in this town. I live in Las Vegas, and I go to local gyms quite a bit. Hopefully I'll stumble on a good human interest story, and frequently I do. And I don't know any white fighters who are racist. I mean, because I think there's a mutual respect among fighters of different ethnic groups that wipes away a lot of the prejudice you see in the general society.
Right.
Okay. If I'm not Jewish, but if I was a boxer and back in the 30s where every third fight was against a Jewish opponent, I don't see how I could possibly be anti-Semitic because, there's a bond that's formed between prize fighters and, that tends to wipe away a lot of that nonsense.
That's a good point. Angelo gave me Jimmy McLaren's phone number. I waited my whole life to meet him. And I got to speak to him briefly. This is like a year or two before he died. And I asked him about Benny Leonard. And he said, I didn't want him to take the fight. He was my idol. I didn't want to hurt him.
Yeah.
And I would have given him the money, but he said he didn't want it. He didn't want charity. So he said, I don't know if you're aware of this, son, but I sued the New York papers because they called me the Jew killer, the Hebrew scourge. And he said, I went to them and he said, these are my friends. It's not personal.
Yeah.
It's just a fight. He said, I still go out when I'm in New York for dinner with Benny Leonard 3 or 4 times a week. I'm still friends with Sid Terrace. I'm still friends of, he said, I was great friends of Barney Ross. We spoke every single night.
With whom he had 3 classic fights.
Right. And he said it wasn't personal. I thought I won the 3rd fight. He got it, but I'm not angry at him, And when he had his drug problems, I tried to help him. And just as you said, we share an experience no other 2 people on earth shared. So he said the racism it can enter into it, But McGovern, and in particular, when he was fighting on the way up, I mean, he never drew the color line when he was champion, like John L. Sullivan did. He fought anyone and everyone, and he was great. What was the turning point that put him on the downside? Was it too much acting and away from the ring, or was it the Corbett fight? Corbett just took it out of him.
Yeah, that's a good question. You mentioned acting. Back in Terry McGovern's day and in George Dixon's day, a boxer would make more money traveling the country with vaudeville troops. He would have a little skit, a little shtick, and be part of a vaudeville troupe. And the most prominent boxers, actually, that was their major source of income until the arrival of fight films. Now, you ask, the funny thing about Terry McGovern is that he's one of those fighters that seemed to have grown old overnight. When he fought young Corbett II in Connecticut on Thanksgiving Day, I think 1902, and was knocked out early in a robust fight. And it was a real shocker. It was one of the biggest upsets ever up to that point in time. But it was like he had grown old overnight. And we've seen that in the case of some boxers. We have it in terms of their ring acumen. And in McGovern's case, you could build a case that he spent too much time on the road with vaudeville troops. I mean, if you're going on the road, you're not keeping good hours because, these are evening performances. And so when you should be a good boxer should be going to bed, so that was, it was theorized that Terry McGovern's hollow performance against young Corbett II was a result of the fact that he had spent too much time on the road with vaudeville troops.
And so he just wasn't in the right mind frame mentally, and physically he just wasn't trained well enough.
Yeah, you know what? Yes, and also I think he had some domestic problems. I saw one allusion. I didn't put it in my book, but I saw one allusion which suggested that his wife may have cheated on him and he might have discovered it and that messed with his mind. But I didn't put that in the book. Maybe I shouldn't even say it. But, and it wasn't in a boxing book, by the way.
Pardon me?
I said it was not in a boxing book, by the way. It was
right. But that would be enough to crush someone that you would go out and not care. But in your book, you mentioned how he just rushed right at him, which was a foolish strategy. Because with McGovern, there was no feeling out rounds.
That's correct. He did not. He was that's true. He charged right at his opponent.
Was that just the only
style? As the bell rang. Pardon me?
Was that the only style that, it didn't occur to him to think, I haven't fought him, so maybe I should see what he has? Or he didn't care?
I can't put myself in his mind.
Oh, okay.
Okay. But he was, Mike Tyson was sort of the same way. There was no fancy Dan about him.
Right.
So who knows? When McGovern's, to me, his marquee win didn't come against Dixon because they were in different stages of development, but against an English boxer called Peddler Palmer.
That was
devastating. They called him Box of Tricks. They fought up in Westchester County, about a 30-minute train ride from Manhattan. And McGovern just blew right through him and took him out in the opening round. And Palmer was considered, especially by people in England, to be the cleverest fighter on the planet. But cleverness, can't stop a hurricane.
No. It's funny because I've read about that. The way you mentioned that in your book is wonderful. And just how people, the British at ringside, and even some of the Americans, were saying, well, this could go 15 or 20, and Palmer's going to do this and do that.
Yeah.
The bell rings, bang, out.
They said the same thing about Michael Spinks when he fought Mike Tyson in Atlantic City. Every expert says, well, the longer the fight goes, the better chance Michael Spinks has of defeating Tyson. Well, theoretically, I guess that was true, but of course, Mike Tyson didn't let Michael Spinks have a second of rest and took him out, 91 seconds or something?
Yeah.
So all that theory went out.
I love
throw that out with the garbage.
It's my favorite story about the word theoretically.
Yes.
I just finished a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt in the home front during the Second World War. And they said two of Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet members, Harry Hopkins and Harold Ickes, were talking. And Harold Ickes was against FDR's programs and welfare to help people. And he said, it'll toughen them up, and theoretically, they'll be tougher and better in the future. And Harry Hopkins said, the problem is people don't eat theoretically. We eat every day.
Yeah.
And I had to laugh, but I thought that's a good point. You know, theoretically, the fight's supposed to go, but that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, I mean, are there more films of McGovern that we know were taken other than the fight with Dixon? Because I haven't seen any.
I'm not a fight film collector, and I'm not the person to ask, really. The late Bill Caton and Jim Jacobs had that wonderful storehouse of old films, and some of which have popped up on YouTube nowadays, but I'm not aware. I'm not qualified to answer your question.
Well, I spoke with Steve Lott, who worked with them, the late Steve Lott.
Yes.
And he was saying the problem with the films from that era, all fight films were owned by the mafia. So he said we could get them and buy them from the mafia for a lot of money and still had to keep paying. But he said they owned them all. And so
they didn't own the originals, but they came to own, especially if there had been only one copy.
Right.
They came to own it. Obviously the word mafia didn't exist back in the days of John L. Sullivan and whatever.
Right.
But the few fights of his and his contemporaries, Corbett and so forth, the original fight films. I've read that. They originally fell into the hands of gangsters, and they weren't going to let them go without a pretty penny.
Steve Lott told me a story where Bill Caton sent him somewhere in the Bronx to pay a guy. He said it was a 5'2" old Jewish man in his 90s. He invites Steve Lott in. He has his Jamaican caretaker make some cookies for him, and they're talking. And the guy says to Steve, "You're a nice boy." Steve gives him the check. Here's the box of films. And when they get back to the office, Steve said he almost had a stroke because there was an article on this guy that Bill Caton gave him. The guy was one of the top Murder Incorporated killers. And Steve said that he looked like a little nebbish, an accountant. He said he was. That's why no one feared him when he walked up there. You wouldn't expect. He said, why wasn't he tried? Because it came out a year ago and he's 92. What are they going to do? I mean, they're not going to put him in jail now. And he only killed gangsters. But this guy had incredible films. And Steve said the most valuable film, if you want to retire, is we know there were films of heavy grip, but they've never been found. So my friend Jason Winters, who wrote a book on Dixon.
Correct.
Which you're aware of.
Yeah, who I alluded to before. His book really ends, for all practical purposes, when Dixon is in New Orleans as part of that triple header, that Festival of Champions.
And he found the book Dixon wrote at the University of Windsor in Ontario just by fluke. He just volunteered one weekend to help go through old dusty boxes, and he pulled it out.
I think obviously it's obvious to me that book was ghostwritten.
Yeah. I mean,
sure. And most boxing memoirs of antiquarian prize fighters were all ghostwritten, and which is understandable. I mean, even today was, when when Michelle Obama comes out with her memoir, she didn't just sit down by herself in a private room and write that out in longhand. Obviously, she had the assistance of a professional ghostwriter.
Angelo told me once, I was telling him how I bought the book The Greatest, and he said the great thing about that book, Ali never wrote it, nor did he read it. He said it was written by Richard Durham from the Nation of Islam. and he
Yes.
said nothing in that book is of truth.
Yeah.
He said
yeah.
Muhammad never threw his medal in the river; he just lost it.
Right.
He loses a lot of things because he
Yep.
doesn't care about material
Yeah.
wealth, you know. So McGovern and Dixon. Does McGovern still have relatives that are alive today?
I'm not aware. You would think so.
Because his son
He
died.
did. No, he should. Let me put it this way: we know that his wife. He was only married once, and we know that they had one son, and we know that both are deceased. And so he would not have any immediate relatives. But of course, he had brothers and nephews and cousins, and I'm sure there are some people in his family tree that are still around, but I wouldn't know how to find them.
I know that his son died at 38, you said.
His son died at a very young age, yeah.
Do we know what from?
Oh boy, I knew it one time, and I don't think it was
Tuberculosis or
I forget, to be honest. I forget. If you got 20 minutes, I'll go find a copy of the book and thumb through it, and maybe I can dig it out. But I'm sorry, I don't want to put that through you.
with George Dixon, we know that he was married to Tom O'Rourke's sister, Kitty.
Yes.
And I don't know if he had any children or not.
I'm not aware he did.
Oh, okay.
And that marriage, there have been some who have questioned whether or not that was Tom O'Rourke's sister, although it's generally agreed that she was. He was married to a white woman. That's true. But I don't know. That marriage eventually dissolved, but I couldn't find out when or what the circumstances were. But when George Dixon finally died, he died alone basically in a boarding house. In a room. Very, very, very sad. So, excuse me.
Okay. Yeah, it was.
Let me stop that. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Excuse me. Well, I guess that's not how they do it on the major networks. I apologize.
We're not a major network by any means. I was going to say, I have tried with the help of Tony G, the British boxing historian, to track Kitty O'Rourke. And I've gone on Ancestry.com. She just fell off the face of the earth. I found little bits and pieces and one or two lines alluding to her from British newspapers that Tony sent me. But there's no record. George Dixon has a great grandnephew that's a school teacher in Toronto that I speak to occasionally. And so I speak to him and he goes, there's stories about this. I like to hear them. He said, well, let's go out to a fight. There's no fights going on here. Can't we just
got to go to Montreal. There's a couple of promoters, as you know, in Montreal who have been pretty active.
And also I've been in touch with Rosalind Byers, who's a great-great-grandniece of George Byers.
Okay.
So she's had an interesting stories about him, but it would be great to find a living relative of Terry McGovern. The poster of the vaudeville thing is such a gorgeous poster of him, and it's hard for people today to realize how big a star he was, how many thousands of people lined up to see him everywhere he went.
Well, when I said that you had to be part of vaudeville troops, they actually built plays around Terry McGovern. So it wasn't just, some of the boxing vaudevillians, basically they would do a little sparring session and maybe invite someone out of the audience, usually a plant, to come up and spar with. And maybe Sugar Ray Robinson had a shtick where he was jump rope. He was just incredible jump roper. But they actually built plays around Terry McGovern. He was that big. Or they took plays that were successful and they made him the lead. And that was very unusual for boxers back in those days to get that kind of role that went beyond the fact that made them something more than the occupation they had, that of a prize fighter.
Was it McGovern's, not just the success in the ring, but his fact that he was so charismatic? This was a good-looking, great-looking, young, charismatic young man.
Yeah, I wouldn't call him a matinee idol, but he was a good-looking Irish kid, and the constituents for boxing back in McGovern's day were overwhelmingly Irish. It helped to be Irish, and most of the fighters most of the white fighters circa 1900, not only the fighters, but the seconds, the managers, the promoters were Irish.
Mm-hmm. Tom O'Rourke, all those guys. Yeah. Yeah. He because they said John L. Sullivan did the same thing, but he couldn't act. And the only one who was good was James J. Corbett, who actually had a little bit of skill at it.
I've read there were people who thought James J. Corbett was as good an actor as anyone else on the stage back then.
Wow.
You're right. That he was a great actor. With John L. Sullivan, his routine when he went on tour was usually blacksmithing, like Bob Fitzsimmons. They'd have a little, he'd have a little thing where he'd forge something, but as far as acting, no, that was not his forte.
No, there's a great story I read about him, and I had to ask. It might have been in Andrew Eisenberg's book, John L. Sullivan and the Irish in America. I had to ask someone. I didn't know what it meant. Where he went on stage once because he was a notorious drunk, and he said, "I'm John L. Sullivan. I'm drunker than a fiddler's bitch," and I didn't know what that meant until I looked it up and I asked people, and someone said back in those times, fiddlers in saloons would play the fiddle, and people to say thank you would send them drinks, but they couldn't take the drinks because they'd get drunk and stop playing. So they had to have their wife take the drink. And then their wife would get hammered. And so he said, "I'm drunker than a fiddler's bitch."
I've never heard that before in my life. That's fascinating.
Neither have I. I mean, it's
this podcast has been very educational for me.
Now, I'm trying to remember what I wanted to ask you about. Yes. So McGovern didn't draw the line about whoever he would fight. And Dixon certainly didn't have the ability to do that. Dixon fought Walter Egerton, right? The Kentucky Rosebud, and the Rosebud knocked him out. But then wasn't Dixon suffering from a fever and they agreed to just spar and Rosebud took advantage of it, or it was a legitimate knockout?
Apparently it was a legitimate knockout, and we should point out that they kept fighting after Dixon was allowed time to recover, which you'd never see today. Walter Egerton was a long-in-the-tooth black fighter from Philadelphia, had a big reputation there in the so-called city of brotherly love, and he and Dixon sparred several times on vaudeville stages. And after Egerton knocked him out, there was a move afoot to put them together in a real prize fight. But that, for some reason, that died on the vine. But Egerton and Dixon fought several times, and at least one occasion, Egerton knocked him out. And yeah, Tom O'Rourke said that Dixon. This was, by the way, a charity fight, and Dixon fought a lot of fights where a good portion of the proceeds would go to some charity. This particular fight with Egerton in Philadelphia, as I recall, I believe there was a strike there of people working in factories that produced some sweaters or something like that. And it was a prolonged strike, and the proceeds were earmarked for the strikers and their families. And Dixon, from what we've read, normally would not have taken this, but he didn't want to disappoint the people who would benefit from it. And so he went into the ring with a fever, perhaps, and got himself knocked out.
One of the things, I think I read it in your book, is that what appeared in the paper about fights often depended on what fighter's manager got to the phone first.
That line came from a book by an old boxing manager called Dan Morgan, Dumb Dan Morgan, they called him. He was so talkative that they called him Dumb Dan. And he said, yeah, out in the hinterlands, where they didn't, the fight wasn't big enough to have a telegrapher at ringside. So you had to get to the telegraph office, wherever the telegraph office was. And in the hinterlands, there might not be any boxing writers present. Okay, so the result of the fight, depended on who got to the telegraph office first, and sent the dispatch back to New York or wherever. And so, obviously, whoever got to the telegraph first had a biased opinion of what had actually just transpired. But that frustrates, and you being a historian would know this. It's the most frustrating thing, and it's actually the most fascinating thing. Is you read reports of old fights in different papers, and the discrepancies are huge. I mean,
yes.
It's you can see that somebody's lying, if not both. Yes. What I mean? And it's frustrating, but then it sends us off to try and find the real truth. And so that's why we actually like it too. It's fuel for an author.
Well, that's one of the thousands of things I love about your book, and in this one in particular, you mentioned that you said, either this happened, but another newspaper reported this happened, and it drives you nuts reading it, thinking,
yes,
they can't both have happened. I mean, isn't there but it's unbelievable, and you have to wonder who was watching the fight. I mean, are you that pro that fighter that you can't be honest? But like you said, it leaves you going to try to do a deeper dive.
Yes.
And into what happened. So,
yes.
In my book, the first fight that I cover is from 1772, and the one that we can, not categorically, but we can pretty much say it was a fixed fight. There have been other fixed fights in Britain, but it's hard to really say for sure it was. Yes. This is the one where all evidence pointed to it. And Tony was just showing me the different reports, but he said, if you really do your work, you'll find contemporary reports.
Yes.
That will tell you what happened. And then you can draw, from that what actually happened.
Yeah. One of the, nowadays there are so many old newspapers on the web. I'm talking about newspapers that have long died, and there's so much material now on the internet that, I remember going to college, and when it was time to write a term paper, it meant a trip to the library and scrolling through these clunky microfilm machines in the library. When I went to University of Nebraska, the only old newspapers I remember on microfilm were the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, maybe the LA Times, and of course the local paper, whatever that. So you didn't, you had to depend upon what was in these papers, and some of these papers were high tone, and so they didn't cover the sporting spectrum like the tabloids, the burgeoning tabloids did. There were no tabloids on microfilm in the library, no old issues of the New York Post or any of these papers. And so you got a very narrow perspective historically when it came to the sphere of sports. But now there's so much cool stuff on the web. It's amazing.
Yeah, when I started university in 1978, and same as you, I would say, well, that's another 8 hours I'm going to be spending in the reference library. That's great. And when I would look up fighters, Harry Gilmore, Carl Tremaine, different fighters, I would think, especially of Gilmore, there's nothing on him in the two main papers. And
yes.
One of the librarians said, those are the two main papers that exist today. They existed then, but there were other smaller papers.
Oh, sure.
And I didn't realize that. And she gave me a list of like 20 of them. And I had to go through each one and go, oh, okay, here's a good article on that.
Yeah.
With Carl Tremaine, who was born in Listowel, Ontario, there's very little of him on the internet at all. We know he was Canadian. And then Steve Canton wrote something about how that he was actually Italian and half his family lived in Detroit and then Cleveland, and the other half lived here because they were too big to all live together. And so the family in Detroit says, you know, he had his career in Cleveland. But when I spoke to family members in Canada, they said that's completely false.
Yeah.
So they said, we've read the article. There's no truth. So it's hard to find, you know, at times, based on what you see.
Yeah.
You know, you can only go by what they have. So doing an article on Joe Grimm was not difficult because there were so many hundreds of things on him, whereas other fighters, you know, especially with the coverage in Canada. But McGovern and Dixon were covered all over the world. I mean, these were world figures.
Yeah, and after his career went south and his skills had dulled, George Dixon spent the better part of 3 years in England and had a ton of fights over there.
514 rounds, you said he fought.
Pardon me?
You said he fought 514 rounds.
That could be. I forget the exact number. It compressed within like a 3.5 year span.
Wow.
I mean, that's amazing. Some of those rounds, by the way, in England circa 1900 were 2-minute rounds. So we should put that in perspective. Which ones were and which ones weren't, I wasn't able to narrow it down that tightly. And
did Dixon's lack of money, did that come from the fact that he was a gambler and a drinker as well? Yeah, he spent it quickly, and as well as Tom O'Rourke, you know, ripping him off?
I guess it's hard to say. Many boxers in Dixon's era were degenerate horse players. That was well, for one thing, horse racing was so big back then, but so many boxers, young Corbett II, for example, and Terry McGovern, blew a lot of money at the racetrack. That's where boxers would go in their downtime. Actually, there was a lot of overlap between the boxing gym and the racetrack. You'd meet the same people in both places.
Right. Yeah, it still happens today. I mean, people, you know, back then, entertainers lost fortunes at the racetrack too. They just couldn't resist it.
At the racetrack and in what were called pool rooms, which were off-track betting places, which at one time were all over the country, all over the United States. The movie The Sting, that wonderful comedy, I love that movie so much. Their depiction of the off-track betting facility in Chicago is spot on from what I've read. That's exactly what they look like, with the results being read off a ticker by a person with a microphone, a megaphone, or whatever, and it was
all controlled by the mafia. The mob controlled all of those things.
They control some fast. Well,
I mean, the betting part.
I got to think about that because they were all over the country. There were a lot of mom and pop places.
That's true, but I mean, the major places in LA and New York, Lansky and Luciano had that, and
yeah.
So a lot of that.
Well, yeah. When horse players bet on the telephone instead of going to a betting shop, the guy at the other end of the telephone had some connection to organized crime. By and large, that's true. But the actual physical place, and like I say, the United States was honeycombed with off-track betting parlors. The actual physical place, a lot of them were mom and pop operations. The mafia may have had its fingers in such things as the wall boards, which showed the races around the track, and and maybe even the chalk that was used to put the odds on the blackboard. But a lot of those were kind of mom and pop operations run by local people.
Yeah, the mob didn't really get involved in boxing until the Dempsey-Carpentier fight, because the $1 Million Gate, they looked at it and thought, there's money to be taken here. Where it's before, even for Burns Johnson, 30 grand, I read where someone said they would be paying out more to their thugs than they would taking the money in. So it wasn't until the $1 Million Gates where they thought, okay, we can control this.
That kind of makes sense. It's generally agreed that the mobsters were thickest in the sport of professional boxing during the Depression years.
Yeah, with Oney the Killer Madden, and George Chuvalo knew him, and I knew Carbo and Palermo were involved in it, Frankie Carmo and Blinky Palermo. I didn't thought they got involved to the late 40s. And Chris Dundee said, no. They were there in the early 30s. They were right there. And he said, back then, the only thing they wanted to hear was, yes, sir. And there's nothing you could do about it. And black fighters, once again, had nothing, got ripped off by them. And Chris Dundee said the only fighter who probably wasn't touched was Jimmy McLarnin, because his manager, Pop Foster, had actually grew up in England beside Oney Madden. And so no one screwed with McLarnin. But I don't know if I agree, because he was going to retire after he won the title. When he re-won the title from Ross. And when he defended against Ross in the third fight, he said, if I win this, I'm gone. And what I've been told is that, it's the Depression. He's the biggest money earner in boxing. They couldn't let him go.
Could be, As I say, this podcast is very educational for me.
Okay.
So I know the people you reference, but I don't know the minute details the way you do.
Well, you heard of the fight with Barbados Walcott and Kid Levine.
Yes,
San Francisco, right? Where gamblers told that Walcott, you got to lose.
Yeah. And that wasn't uncommon back then either, where understanding that if a fight went the distance, it was a prearranged draw, or even telling a fighter, the only way you can win this fight is by knockout. If it goes the distance, you lose.
Right. And the difference between them and the Mafia, of course, was the Mafia made it a national organization. These were local guys in different cities.
Yeah.
It's just, I know Dan Fleischer wrote a book on McGovern. Why hasn't there, it's hard to say why there hasn't been a movie. I mean, he had such an incredible life, and he was such a meteor bursting through the sky. I mean, this was an incredible person.
People forget about you. You know what I mean? Even I'm not sure a movie about his life, would be commercial. I could, however, see a series on a cable network like they did with Atlantic City and so forth. That to me would work. But what am I to know? That's not my business. I'm a writer. I'm not a producer.
Right, but I mean, there should be, because he deserved to be remembered, and if not for you, he's not remembered. I mean, as I said, you brought him back and put flesh on the bones on him and Dixon, and I fell in love with Terry McGovern reading about him in your book.
Well, thank you.
I mean, he was just. I wish there was more film, and it breaks my heart that there's not film of him talking. I would have loved to hear how
that would be great.
That would be great. Just such a wonderful fighter. Where can people get your books? They can get them online at Amazon.
Everybody goes to Amazon nowadays, and it makes sense. The publishing house for those two books you're holding up is McFarland.
Right.
It's a publishing house in North Carolina. They do a lot of
Right.
baseball books and boxing books. It's not one of the major publishing houses, but it's a nice, hardworking, honorable publishing house. And McFarland, so you can go McFarland.com or Amazon, which seems to have every book in the universe and has killed all those wonderful, nice mom and pop, retail bookstores.
It breaks my heart because
Yes.
Because one of my favorite things, my daughter still loves this. When we go to old bookstores, secondhand bookstores, or mom and pop stores, and there is a giant retailer in Canada that owns all the bookstores, and it's a time and place in North America where it was just so much fun to go. Like you mentioned this in the intro to the book, where you could just go and you could spend a day. You could just relax and look at all these old things, and it was just fantastic. And
I was with you, and occasionally we'd stumble on a little prize. But yeah, when I went to a city, and I appreciate your time today, by the way, but when I went to a city on vacation, I would always go to a independent brick and mortar bookstore and rummage around, and sometimes find a real cool book, and it made the trip great. But where are those independent brick and mortar bookstores? They're all gone, unfortunately, almost all gone.
And it's sad. It's very sad. When I went to Halifax, when I was doing stand-up comedy in the early 80s, I went into a secondhand bookstore. I found the book 10 and Out by Alexander Johnson from the 1920s.
Yeah.
$3.
Yeah.
And then I keep looking, and they have the autobiography for $2 of Ingemar Johansson. I'm not a big fan, but for $2, I'd be an idiot not to buy it. And then in Toronto, there was an old bookstore about to close. It'd been around for 80 years. And they had the great fighters of the prize ring written by that British fighter. And so it had Frank Craig, who you mentioned in your book, I think the Harlem Coffee Cooler, and it had Dixon and George Godfrey and Peter Marr, and I mean, it had all these great fighters, and it was like $8. And my daughter said, "Are you going to buy it?" And I said, "Yes." You know how old this is? I don't think there's a copy anywhere in the world of this book. And I asked, "How old is that?" And that guy said, "Well, it was here when my grandfather ran the store 60 years ago." So I said, "Oh, I'll pay you anything for it." And I still have it. So, I mean, it's such a wonderful book. And
well, maybe someday you and I can, I don't know what bookstore it would be, but if they, maybe someday you and I will find ourselves in one of the last remaining brick and mortar independent bookstores and wind up fighting over a copy of a book. But I'll let you have it. I'll let you have it.
Great.
Because you were so kind to do this podcast.
Well, you've been very kind to do this. I just wanted to say, with my book, I spoke to Colleen Aycock, and she helped me out. And she said, speak to Charlie Purdue, who at McFarland. So I sent my book, and he said, "I love your book." Not I love, but I like your book. He said, "But it's way too long. So you're going to have to cut 10 to 15 chapters." And he said, "The only other thing I would tell you is take out the redundancies." I understand that Jack Welch was paid off by Ad Wolgast, but you don't have to mention it 12 times.
Oh, well, okay. He's the editor there, so.
Yeah. And everything he said was perfect. So yeah, I took it to heart. So just a wonderful person, as are you. I want to thank you so much for being on the show and for your patience with us. And I want to remind people, you don't have a boxing collection unless you have this book. And this is a wonderful book, Clash of the Little Giants. And it's boxing history. You can't enjoy boxing today unless you know the history of the sport, and no one knows it better and writes about it better than Arne Lang. And this is the best boxing book ever written. This is the Nelson-Wolgast Fight in the San Francisco boxing scene. 1900 to 1914. And when I read this book, I thought, who is Arne Lang? I have to meet him because it's fantastic. So please go to Amazon. Please go to McFarland, MCFARLAND. You can get all of Arne's books, and they're fantastic reads. And they're not only enjoyable, but you'll come out in a great mood because you'll have learned something as well as enjoyed yourself. And I want to thank you, Arne, for being our guest today on Ring Talk. And I look forward, I hope so, in the future that we can meet in person so I can give you a big hug.
Thank you, Lou. Let's keep in touch.
Yes, absolutely. You be well.
Thank you, buddy.
Take care. Okay. I think. Okay. So guys, how's that?